plan is, I mean, we'll just do a conversation. I mean, this is one of those topic area, you know, like there's so many things. So I put a like small disclaimer that, you know, we are not expert on everything, you know. So we can start with like, you know, EU's policy about one China.
Yeah.
So like one China thing is one of the like big things just hanging around.
Yeah.
I really want you to like, you know, give us some kind of walk us through, like, I mean, it looks like Germany and France are saying that, oh, do you know what, we understand what it is. China doesn't need to, you know, re-educate us. What does it mean? We know the default position, but what's the default position? It's like, you know, there are lots of strategic ambiguity with this thing, which might work well for the West, but at the same time, you know, how long?
Well, the People's Republic of China has always had this position since the Chinese Communist Party came to power and formed the People's Republic of China, that Taiwan is formally part of the People's Republic of China, right? So it calls this the one China principle, that there is one government of China and that sovereignty is indivisible. And the political entity that refers to itself as the Republic of China or as Taiwan is an illegitimate government, right? And the way that the international community has responded to this is that when they've established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, which was not automatic for most Western countries, right? They maintained relations with the Republic of China. But, you know, starting with the US in the 1970s, where they had this rapprochement and then switching formal diplomatic relations, is that they've had one China policies, right? So if we take, for instance, the US formally only recognizes the People's Republic of China, and it acknowledges China's claim that it is the sole legitimate government of Taiwan as well. But it doesn't say that it accepts China's claim, it just acknowledges that that's China's position, right? So the one China policy is different from the one China principle. Mm. So this is also the position that the EU has effectively taken, and the EU's is more ambiguous because the EU, at the level of the European Union, it established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1975, but never formally agreed to a one China policy, but never actually formally codified specifically what that is. So it hasn't ever formally recognized that the PRC is the legitimate government of Taiwan. The European Union, nor its member states commit to that position. They all have this one China policy, and it varies depending on the member states. Some of them have like a US style acknowledges this, others simply don't mention it. So the EU's policy is open-ended in terms of the final status of Taiwan, whether that is peaceful reunification, whether it is indefinite maintenance of the status quo, or whether it is eventual independence for Taiwan. So the one China policies for the European Union, for the US, and for many other countries has allowed them this degree of flexibility, where they can have formal diplomatic relations with the PRC, they can have informal political relations and economic relations with Taiwan, and they don't have to answer the question of who is the legitimate government of Taiwan. It's this kind of like ambiguity that's politically convenient, right? So the way that these stated policies actually work in practice are also different. So the European Union's eventual codification, or the nearest it came to codifying its one China policy, was in its 2006 strategic policy paper on China. And it said it doesn't have political relations with Taiwan. But effectively, the EU does have political relations with Taiwan. We now have a EU-Taiwan human rights dialogue. There have been European commissioners giving speeches on EU, Taiwan political and trade cooperation. So the relationship has gone well beyond the economic domain. There is an EU-Taiwan political relationship. So the way the policy becomes effective and put into practice is even more expansive than the stated policy. But the European Union and the US have never accepted China's position that it is the only sole legitimate government of Taiwan. Now, in recent years, China has been trying to push this position that the one China principle that codifies it as the legitimate government of Taiwan has international near universal consensus. And this is like part of this is a myth of consensus, right? It's never been the case, but China's trying to increasingly sell this story that, you know, for years, the US and other governments have accepted that it is the legitimate government of Taiwan, and only now are they changing. That has never been the case. And I'm part of a special issue forthcoming in the China Quarterly, very near, about the One China policies, and the authors of the lead article there, Adam Liff and Dalton Lin, who are two genuine experts on Taiwan, make this quite clear. And maybe in the links to the links with the video, we can put a link to the paper, because the preprint version of their paper is now out, and they make quite clear this distinction between what China specifically says the One China principle is and the One China policies of states, and like clear that they analyze how China's trying to push this myth of consensus, this idea that everybody accepts that it is a legitimate government of Taiwan. But that I guess that is where potentially a problem comes, is that, you know, the ambiguity around this to some extent has created a space for China to do that, because we don't formally recognize Taiwan as well, that they sort of like infer from our lack of recognition is tantamount to recognizing the PRC as legitimate government of Taiwan. But that's not the case. Like, quite simply, the question is unanswered, like, who's the legitimate government or who's the sovereign entity responsible for the territory known as Taiwan, is simply unanswered by a lot of countries around the world. And it's allowed them to pursue their economic and political relationships with the PRC without ever having to take a stance. And this will become an issue, I think, in the future, particularly if the PRC continues to push towards reunification and if force is ever used. Of course, the US has the Taiwan Relations Act, which was in force since 1979, which does create you know, commitments to support foreign defense of Taiwan. And the US has had this strategic ambiguity policy where it suggests that it will intervene in the event of a cross-strait conflict. The exact conditions under which that might transpire has been deliberately left ambiguous by the US. And a lot of people are saying that, you know, it's time for the US to end strategic ambiguity and be very clear about what it will not accept from the People's Republic of China. But that because that would then, the idea is that that would deter China from taking actions that could lead to escalation, and that this would actually be more effective as a deterrent than strategic ambiguity. So, I mean, this kind of position has been challenged at various times, but like Biden saying 3 times, you know, that the US will do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan, and that is a very unambiguous statement, and it kind of suggests that there's potential for, even if Taiwan unilaterally declares independence, maybe the US will come and back up. Whereas in the past, the US has signaled to Taiwan leadership that it wouldn't do that. Because around, for my PhD thesis, when I was writing about the EU-China arms embargo review and the US's involvement there, is that around that time, the Bush administration was signaling to Taiwan that, you know, a potential referendum on independence unilaterally decided by Taiwan at that point in time would not receive US support, because it would essentially drag the US into conflict with the PRC that it didn't want at that time. So there are these kind of questions around the effectiveness of strategic ambiguity, whether the US should clear up. I mean, Bush once said himself, I think in 2001, after the spy plane incident, which was one of the first sort of foreign policy incidents the Bush administration had to deal with, Bush said after that, you know, the US would do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan, and the State Department had to very quickly roll that back because it was inconsistent with their strategic ambiguity position. So, yeah, I kind of went on a tangent there about these various policies, but the ambiguity around this kind of around the status of Taiwan and what states will do to defend Taiwan is becoming harder for states to have like a consistent policy. And I think it's harder for the US to signal to its allies what it specifically wants them to do in relation to Taiwan and China, because it has this ambiguity in its own policies. And we've seen, you know, certain US allies indicating greater support towards Taiwan, like Liz Truss has suggested, even before she was a leadership contender, that the UK should be doing more to support Taiwan, even with potential for arming Taiwan with British military equipment to give it support. So there's, yeah, I mean, I think just in general, Taiwan has become a far more salient issue in the foreign policies of US allies in recent years.
Like if you see a kind of like film script, so the main characters there, so the main characters are the Chinese head of the state, Xi Jinping. And so Xi Jinping is the main guy, and I think he's looking for his third term very soon. Though they made a law, some kind of law that you cannot have more than 2 terms, but it looks like he can go for 3 terms, 4 terms.
Yeah, so the rules have changed that he'll continue on. The succession would have been due this year, but he's going to continue on into an unprecedented 3rd term. And I mean, that's undoubtedly part of what's driving China at the moment in terms of playing to domestic audiences, but also kind of legitimizing the rule, particularly when the party doesn't really have a strong ideological basis. It's about economic competence and sort of restoring China's place in the international system. And Taiwan's become part of that sort of nationalist rhetoric or national myth that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. And so ahead of the sort of installation of Xi for a 3rd term later this year, ideally China wants a stable domestic and international sort of like environment, and the Taiwan crisis at the moment cuts against that. So it's important for Xi to try and look sort of strong and tough in the face of international pressure from the US. So I think that's at least part of an explanatory factor for why China has behaved like this in response to, not although Pelosi's 3rd in line for the US presidency and Speaker of the House, is not like the highest level visit that could be there, and it's not many other countries would react to a politician from one country visiting another part of their, even if it's their perceived territory. This wasn't a visit that was sort of like conferring legitimacy directly to Taiwan's government in a formal sense. So yeah,
I'll come to like Nancy Pelosi a bit later. Like more focus on this Chinese leadership. How confident he is, like in terms of his power, his rhetoric, his the future. He has got lots of plans. One of them is like in 2049, this like rejuvenation plan, which is the Taiwan will be part of China. So that's like kind of he's making history. And obviously the China has been doing some kind of military like development since 90s, and I think it will finish in 2035. So lots of things are on track, but at the same time, coronavirus affected China big way. And I saw like some of the like big, because China is big on business, but their property industry more or less collapsed, and that hit quite big in terms of their domestic economy. So can you just like give us some kind of idea like what's going on in terms of those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on China's domestic politics by any means, but I do think you're right to flag up the impact of coronavirus and how that's impacted upon how the Chinese government views itself to a large degree, because their zero COVID strategy hasn't worked out. They need to keep imposing increasingly authoritarian lockdowns on parts of the population like Shanghai, which, as you mentioned, is obviously a big business center, a global one. And it's really important to the Chinese economy, but these lockdowns are having negative implications for the population. So trying to sort of reassert this idea that they're in control as part of the current government's approach. And I think you're right, like in terms of the long-term history-making plays by President Xi has always been a part of his approach to domestic and foreign affairs since he became the top leader of the country. And yeah, so the Belt and Road Initiative is one example of that, and this whole idea of national rejuvenation, reunification of Taiwan formally with the mainland by 2049 is another one of these large goals. So, but I think, and when you said like in terms of his power, I think to some extent I agree with those that are saying that there's the reaction to Taiwan recently has shown that China is somewhat overconfident in its ability to deter other actors from going against what it wishes. There's been some speculation that the Chinese government ramped up the rhetoric around what it would do in response to Pelosi's visit because they thought it would work and it would deter the US from allowing Pelosi to visit. But it didn't. So then they had to follow up with it. Otherwise, they would look incredibly weak if they said they were going to, take action and then didn't. But there's also a degree, I think, that China kind of mishandled this in the sense, not just in terms of like reacting to a politician visiting, but I think they could have not made a big deal out of it to begin with and just said, doesn't matter. Taiwan's government, like the Taiwan is inconsequential, or Taipei's claims to self-governance are inconsequential. It doesn't matter who visits them. Taiwan, as far as we're concerned, is still part of the People's Republic of China. This doesn't change much. So I think they kind of overemphasized the visit themselves because it was originally planned back for April, and then it was delayed due to Pelosi getting COVID, and it pushed back. And in those intervening months, like if you look at the kind of Chinese rhetoric around like the original planned visit, the rhetoric has escalated considerably because of this time lag they've ramped up. I think that has worked out really badly for China because they have said so many things and they've made it seem like a much bigger deal than it really needed to be from their perspective. So, but I think it does. My reading is that it does demonstrate a degree of insecurity amongst the PRC, that they need to defend every inch of that. And that's not just about foreign audiences, I think that's about domestic audience as well. And because under Xi's government, they have really pushed or they've really encouraged Chinese nationalism expression amongst the public, that they then have to act to support that position because, people, their supporters now sort of associate them with this strong position on Taiwan, and any sorts of signs towards upgrading relations with Taiwan has to receive any upgraded relations or any signs of upgrading relations from the international community has to receive some kind of response from the People's Republic of China.
So that's a bit of good background about Xi. But if you move to like Taiwan, the Taiwan is like new leadership. So she's like more pro-independence kind of person, but she doesn't push for that. So she loves it, but she doesn't push for it. So that's more strategy. And I think that the previous government, Kuomintang, so the Chiang Kai-shek's party, so they're like more kind of blamed for, they're more proposing like reunification of China. So this like two things, two parties blame each other for the things which they are not actually 100%. So like they have to be more strategic as well. But I mean, when Pelosi was going there, it's not like that Taiwan is not a big country. So if someone, the speaker from America, wants to come to your country, you'll not say no. I mean,
yeah, and I think, and it's good. Like in that sense, Pelosi's visit for Taiwan is significant. And Taiwan isn't a huge country, but it is economically important. I think particularly at the moment, Taiwan is a key player in the global semiconductor supply chain, is really significant, strategically significant, for Western economies, but also for China as well. Like this is a major issue in the 21st century. So I think there is kind of like that kind of level of interest for the US too. But yeah, I think like one of the things that we've seen, again, not an expert in Taiwanese domestic politics, is that there is growing public support, as I understand it, for Taiwanese independence, or at least those there's less degree of neutrality on the issue. So I think for Taiwan, it is a sort of diplomatic victory to have Pelosi visit. Yeah, it is the first time a Speaker of the House of Representatives has visited in 25 years. The last one was Newt Gingrich. So that is a kind of a win. And what we've seen over the past few years since the onset of the pandemic is that Taiwan has seen a number of diplomatic victories, in part because Taiwan was perceived as handling the pandemic fairly well without resorting to the degree of authoritarianism that People's Republic of China has. And in the early stages of the pandemic, Taiwan was really good at providing support in terms of PPE, particularly to European countries. And, it was recognized openly by EU officials and politicians as standing in solidarity with the EU. And previously, European policymakers would have been more hesitant to praise Taiwan openly for fear of repercussion or repudiation from the PRC. But they went ahead and did this, and there was quite a lot of analysis that suggests that Taiwan was a diplomatic winner out of the COVID-19 pandemic because it was seen as a responsible global player. And a number of EU member states openly started supporting Taiwan getting observers participation status within the World Health Organization, something the People's Republic of China is strongly against. And French politicians in particular were strongly supportive of this. So I think now about half of the EU member states in total either openly praised Taiwan for its support of Europe, and I think 7 of them those have also called for Taiwan to have participation in the World Health Organization, which again, in previous years, say going back even only 4 or 5 years, you wouldn't really have had EU policymakers doing that because they were just scared of the economic repercussions of anger in China, and there was little to be gained diplomatically by voicing support for Taiwan. But increasingly in the past 2 or 3 years, we've now seen more European policymakers who are willing to say, Taiwan's a partner. We should have better relations with Taiwan. It's a democracy. It's like-minded to the EU. It stands for the same values as we do, and therefore we should be explicit in our support about it, irrespective of the kind of potential consequences from the People's Republic of China. And I think that's a significant shift in the fact that, the EU for a long time just didn't really talk about Taiwan openly very much, but now we're seeing the policymakers are moving towards a more open position.
I mean, just recently, I was reading a couple of articles last couple of days because Taiwan is such an interesting topic area. So the Chinese ambassador in France, she was asked question about this recent visit of Pelosi and things, and on live TV, more or less, she was very furious and said that Taiwan needs to be re-educated. So that's the word she used.
Yeah. Usually that's kind of the rhetoric they use, is re-education after reunification and so on. And the actual opinions of people in Taiwan do not matter to the People's Republic of China, or they simply project their interpretation and say, the Taiwanese people, really do want, they will understand that it's in their interest to be part of the People's Republic of China. So, I think we'll see more of this as well. But I think it's also interesting that, Chinese diplomats are being asked more openly about these issues, and, the journalists are willing to stand up and say, ask them about some of these absurd policies and actions as well. I think it's good to see journalists.
I think there is a news on this Global Times, which is Chinese kind of intellectuals kind of media outlet. So basically they're saying that Pelosi will come here, but our fighter jets will escort her plane, and then
Yeah, I mean, the Global Times is nothing more than a propaganda outlet. And if you look at his Twitter account, they were talking about, the US will now have to face the consequences of allowing Pelosi to visit. And like one of the tweets contained the phrase, "Don't say we didn't warn you," or something to that, like as kind of paraphrase. I'm not even pretending to be anything other than, a mouthpiece for the government at that point. So I think we'll see. I mean, this strident rhetoric isn't anything particularly new, but neither, I mean, we should also point out that the missile tests, although the intensity and the proximity to Taiwan has increased, over the past couple of years, China has been using military intimidation tactics towards Taiwan. And if you look at it, I've been really interested to read a number of news reports from Taiwan, where Taiwanese citizens have mostly been unbothered, by these tests and so on. They're just kind of like, we're used to it at this point. We don't really think they're going to start shooting us. They're just trying to intimidate us. So we're just going to go on about our lives as best we can, which I think is, and it's unfortunate that that's kind of the position that they're living under, that they become sort of immune to the news of these missile tests and so on. But I think it also does show their resilience and their defiance against the intimidation by the PRC, which from a personal perspective, I think is very admirable.
I mean, I was reading like New Yorker a couple of days ago, and one of the journalists, he did a couple of interviews with Taiwanese young people in 2005, and the Taiwanese young people's response was quite positive about China. That China is growing exponentially, so there's lots of opportunity there. We can bring lots of good things within China. He did the similar interview in 2015. Now the tone changed, and they are saying that, oh my God, China is like, it's a kind of surveillance country. They will check everything, whatever you are doing. So everything is recorded, everything is on the record. So they are more like cautious this time. They are like more, reluctant to say that, oh, China is a great thing to happen. I think if you do the interview again, I think they'll be seriously said that no.
Yeah. From what I've read so far, it's like, there's even further. And I think that's reflective of the fact that the PRC has become far more assertive and aggressive. And, like in the early 2000s, China was sort of reestablishing itself on the international sphere, or in the international sphere, and it was trying a sort of more sort of charm offensive with its neighbors on around this period. And there was a lot of talk of cross-strait economic cooperation and so on. But I think under Xi, since Xi came to power in 2013, I think what we've seen is just a move away from that and saying, we're going to throw our weight around and get what we want. And sort of like heightened tensions over the South China Sea with the PRC's continued militarization of that region and so on. And, the intimidation tactics over the past couple of years in particular, I think is just pushing more and more people away. And I think, I'm not sure, I'm not saying that, the charm offensive strategy was ever going to win over, Taiwan. I don't really see the PRC as having enough soft power to do that, given the historical context of relations, cross-strait relations since 1949. But I would say this strategy has even less chance of success. And I think that the international community is becoming far more attentive to how the PRC is behaving. And I think, what we've learned about China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and if we look at the national security law and the essential, the very rapid dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, I think a lot more people are kind of seeing that as foreshadowing what could happen in Taiwan if China is kind of left unchecked over the next few years. And, there used to be a degree of optimism that as China's sort of like economy grew and the more it became involved in the global international system, the more sort of it wouldn't necessarily democratize, although that is obviously kind of the classical modernization theory. But the idea was that as it increased its connections with the international system, its interest in stability in that system, and it would be less likely to challenge the status quo. It would stop opposing sort of like a rules-based order and would start to kind of integrate with that. I think this kind of optimism around that has quickly faded. And I would say, like, even looking back at my own sort of views, when I was doing my PhD in the sort of early years after my PhD, I was never like necessarily sold on the idea, but I was definitely more optimistic that was at least a potential path, that, you know, China could successfully be sort of like integrated into the international system, and that this would moderate its behavior. Not to go as far as saying, you know, yeah, you know, China's just a few years away from democratizing or like fully buying into the Western-led international order. But I think the experiences over the past 6-7 years have kind of like pushed me to realize that under Xi, that's just simply not going to happen. So I think, going back to what I was saying about Xinjiang and Hong Kong, I think that's kind of, people are starting to pay attention, and they realize there's probably a limited window of opportunity where we can actually forestall that from potentially happening with Taiwan as well.
Like, I mean, one of the characters is in the like behind the scene, but I thought I would just bring him. So John Kerry is the like climate change envoy for Joe Biden. It looks like John Kerry has got, you know, good connection with Xi. Even like a couple of weeks ago, he actually spoke to him. So I mean, they converse each other quite frequently, because John Kerry's view is like, we need China to fight this thing. So this is a big thing.
Yeah.
So this way, that way, you need China on board in terms of the things you were talking about, this like global system of polity. What do you think? Because I mean, that's another area where, you know, Biden administration invested so much there. They need China.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, for me, climate change is the most pressing issue that the world faces at the moment. And I think it has to condition how we think about everything else too. But I don't think we should then stop other sort of like policies just in order to keep cooperation on climate change. Because like one of the things that's been pointed out is that although China has now suspended talks with the US on climate change, it isn't suspending its own actions on climate change. I mean, China's not going far enough or fast enough on dealing with climate change. I mean, no one really is, but China in particular is not there yet in terms of where it needs to be. But it's increasingly going to be in China's own interests to deal with climate change problems, mitigation, adaptation, and limitation of the damage. So I think there is a degree that, you know, China's going to have to, like, irrespective of what other states do, because otherwise it's shooting itself in the foot if it just continues to, you know, say, you know, okay, because you visited Taiwan, we're going to open more coal power stations and burn more coal. That will teach you a lesson. I don't think that's going to be the long-term strategy. They'll do things like disengaging with talks, but I think they'll eventually come back to the table, even with the US at some point, because this is kind of a historic pattern that China likes to suspend like talks. Usually it's military to military exchanges and so on that it suspends, and this is arguably stepping up a little bit by ruling out climate change. But I mean, this is kind of the thing, like, you know, there are some people who say, no, we don't need China, the rest of the international community can get on with things like, you know, dealing with climate change or nuclear non-proliferation, Iran being one of those where China was part of the talks. North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the six-party talks, China was obviously involved in those. I'm not sure I'd go that far and agree with them and say that the international community can get along fine without China and we don't need them. I think we do need to bring China along with us. I mean, China shouldn't have like a veto over what everybody else does. But in terms of long-term interests of the planet, you know, a country of China's size, there needs to be action there. But yeah, I don't think, you know, things like Pelosi's visit, I don't think a calculus for, you know, a politician from a democratic state shouldn't be, well, is China going to, like, you know, hold up a gun to its own head in respect to climate change talks? And I don't think we should like abandon, you know, support for democratic Taiwan on the basis that China might take some sort of absurd action that would be detrimental to its own long-term interests. I think if countries start allowing that kind of precedent, then we're on a pretty slippery slope with allowing China to dictate more and more of what our foreign policies can look like.
Like the final character is Nancy Pelosi. So Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, also the same administration she belongs to, who is in power. She's like, I think, second in the line. So after president, basically, vice president, and then, so if you take out president, she's in the like second in the line.
Yeah.
So it's pretty high profile. But one thing I learned that in the Newt Gingrich visit to Taiwan in the late 90s, that was actually not like this. That was more like pro-China kind of thing, because he was supporting China's inclusion in the global market. Because those are the times when China was a bit excluded because of the Tiananmen Square crisis. So that visit was not actually as political as this one. But also like Newt Gingrich was like, not as, high profile as Nancy Pelosi. I mean, you see it. But at the same time, Nancy Pelosi came from California, and then, there's a large number of Chinese descent population there. So obviously, so they are also, pushing for this kind of idea. But also like Nancy Pelosi can actually retire in this year. So she's 82. Perhaps this is her, last song she can play, some kind of legacy. But my own take is, so that visit was more kind of casual stuff. It's like, okay, let's go there. It's not like, some kind of plan, big grand plan. And then once China, has got this pushback, then, that made America more determined to do that. So from there, it just escalated. And then at one point, Nancy Pelosi said, no, we have got to do it. And more or less, it worked in American domestic politics because, she was praised, almost like bipartisan kind of support behind this visit. So for Nancy Pelosi, it worked out well at the end.
Yeah, I think the one thing to say about Pelosi is she's a long-term supporter of human rights in China and of Taiwan. She was highly critical of the Beijing government following Tiananmen. In 1991, she was at Tiananmen Square, unfurled a banner, held a vigil, everything like that. She was highly critical of Bill Clinton for, essentially going too far in terms of some of his engagement policies with China, as she saw it, and has long advocated for human rights. And yeah, I think part of this is about legacy building for her as she comes to the end of her political career. But it's consistent with her, position throughout her career. This isn't some kind of opportunistic, stick it to the PRC or just doing what Biden has secretly asked her to do or something. I think it's very much in line with how Pelosi is as a political actor. I think the context is much different now. Like even if you look at the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995 to 1996, China wasn't the economic powerhouse it is now. It's not the military power it is now. Although China was doing military exercises and firing missiles into the water around Taiwan in 1995, 1996, nobody really thought that the use of force was likely. It seemed fairly implausible that China would do this. Now the difference, there's a significant difference, and particularly because of China's military modernization, its strategic rethinking, its focus on anti-access area denial to prevent the US from successfully intervening in a cross-strait conflict. China wants to make sure that the conflict would essentially be over before the US was able to do anything. It also has its own aircraft carriers now, although qualitatively they're nowhere near the US's, but they do have the anti-ship ballistic missile developed about a decade ago, specifically with the US's carrier groups in mind. So I think the political, economic, and military situation has changed significantly, and the risk of use of force has increased. But more than anything, it's more the potential for miscalculation, misunderstanding, miscommunication. These things are really important. And like one of the things like that's changed is that the proximity of China's missile tests to Taiwan are much closer. There was the overflight of the island, and people saying like, why? Surely Taiwan has air defense systems, like surely it should just shoot these missiles down as a signal to China. But I think that Taiwan knows that at the moment China isn't going to directly launch missiles. But if it was to shoot these missiles down, which China, again, remember, it says these are military drills and exercises. Like, if you start shooting down China's missiles, then that could be seen as an act of war, like on that part, and it would give China the pretext to then take action against Taiwan. So the context is highly different, but I think the stakes were raised for Pelosi by the degree of China's reaction to her plans to go, and it became almost impossible for Pelosi to change her mind at this point, because it would give China sort of like, even if it wasn't, directly about like just responding to like the PRC, if it was advice from the US administration, it would give China that sort of like PR victory. And there's been a lot of like sort of speculation that, or like reports that quietly the Biden administration would have preferred that she didn't go, but once she made the decision to go, they would support her. But again, there's no real choice there. The Biden administration couldn't publicly say, no, this is a bad idea, because it just creates too many problems within the US political system. It undermines the US's position vis-a-vis Taiwan. And again, it gives a diplomatic win to the PRC if they were to do that. So it's been interesting to see developments, but the visit itself like went off without a hitch. Like Pelosi was there for a relatively short period of time, and then it's been the sort of like the Chinese reaction ever since. But again, also China's reaction has drawn far more international attention to the incident had they just kind of said, whatever, and Pelosi visits, leaves again. Sure, a lot of like the sort of Western media that follows sort of like high level politics closely, further readers would have reported on it, but I don't think it would have got the mainstream media attention. It wouldn't have made like the evening news. It wouldn't be being reported in sort of like the Western tabloids that have featured quite prominently, a lot of sort of like doomsday predictions and so on in some of the tabloids. But nevertheless, it's getting people, like, we can obviously debate some of the issues around the way that foreign affairs are reported in tabloid newspapers, but nevertheless, it became part of the wider public agenda and like public attention over the past week. And that's the sort of attention that China doesn't want to get, but it created it for itself. So it's a lot of this is, I think, the PRC having to live with the consequences of its own actions here.
Like, I mean, two questions, like, I mean, two kind of conversational questions. Like one is like, it looks like, the philosophical side of the story is this, like two superpowers like fighting each other. And like Taiwan is Malcolm in the middle, so they are taking the brunt of the whole thing. So, I mean, in that sense, no, it's just not fair to Taiwan, like push them into this situation where, Taiwan doesn't have much say in the whole thing. That's not fair. The second question is, so with like Nancy Pelosi, it's the visit, high profile visit, but also we are talking about Xi, the Chinese leader. I mean, he is a nationalist leader. He wants to, for him, this is a good idea. Then he can start up things in his domestic politics, which can, gather more momentum for him. So in that sense, Pelosi's visit actually helped him rather than kind of undermined him.
Well, starting with the first question, I'm not really sure about that kind of framing, because I think it denies Taiwan's agency. Like, I don't think Taiwan is just kind of caught here. Like, I think it's quite clear that Taiwan is now a developed and mature democracy, and that the majority of the population do not want to be part of the People's Republic of China. And if it wasn't for the sort of diplomatic coercion over the past few years that have seen China try to erode as many of the Taiwan's remaining diplomatic partners as it can, the Taiwan would be trying to, you know, increase its international presence and to get itself into more international institutions like the World Health Organization, and trying to increase its sort of like unofficial diplomatic relations with countries, even if they don't fully recognize it as sovereign. Engaging in political cooperation is a big platform of Taiwan's foreign policy at the moment. I think it's quite clear that Taiwan looks for support from the international community, particularly from the US, to allow it to maintain its de facto independence from the People's Republic of China. And I think that any sort of like winding down of that support would be bad news for Taiwan domestically, and you would see a concerted effort from Taiwanese leaders to reignite that support in the future. I mean, for sure, the wider contestation between the US and China at the moment isn't good in terms of it undermines regional stability, and stability is better for smaller countries in the region. But at the same time, Taiwan is an issue in and of its own right, and I don't think it's going to be just a pawn in the game between the two powers. On the second question, yeah, I mean the way I kind of think about it is it's a double-edged sword for Xi. Like, I think it does allow him to sort of like, you know, beat the drum about, you know, the imperialist US and, you know, the secessionist forces that it encourages in Taiwan. And, you know, there's been a lot of like people supportive of the PRC's position saying like, you know, well, what would happen if Wang Yi went to you know, Texas and met with secessionists there and so on, and this sort of like false equivalence, whataboutery approach to these questions. So there is that positive aspect that it does play into Xi's nationalist agenda, but it's also the downside is that it forces China to take actions that potentially destabilize the region at a time when stability is in its interests, and when Xi is trying to, and he doesn't need to consolidate his power. He is pretty solid, I think, in his in terms of support from other policy elites within China. But he, you know, he's not relying on the public's votes or anything. So he doesn't need in that respect. But it is problematic because China has painted itself into, or backed itself into a corner rather, with respect to Taiwan, and it needs to continue to some degree escalating its actions in response to any moves, even small moves by other countries. And I think like a good example of where this has kind of like worked against China is that in 2020, when a delegation from the Czech Senate, including the Senate's president, this is not actually the Czech president, it's just the Senate president, visited Taiwan as an official delegation, right? And the People's Republic of China issued strong statements saying, you know, the Czech Republic had essentially crossed the red line here, right? And they were pushing back and saying there'd be consequences. And usually for China to take on a small European country, usually used to get what it wants, right? The threats of economic repercussions were enough to make smaller EU states often fall in line. And larger EU states would either not respond, or they would like fall behind an EU position. They would like, you know, kind of softly push back against what China was saying. But the reaction from the Czech government was to say, no, hang on, we're a democratic country. You can't tell our politicians what to do. If they want to visit Taiwan, that's perfectly legitimate for them to do so, irrespective of what your position is. And they defended it as being consistent with their one China policy. And we haven't really talked about this, but we should probably come back to this and talk about the difference between the one China policy and Beijing's one China principle. So they argued this, and Germany stepped in as well. And like at this time, you know, the German government was being criticized from all sides for being too soft on China, and they came back and said the Chinese government's reaction to the Czech visit is totally out of proportion, and that this is not on the EU treats its international partners with respect. We'd expect exactly the same in return. And I think that China wasn't prepared for that level of response from the European countries. And I think it was kind of a shift in how the EU deals with it. And like previously, particularly on issues like Taiwan, where there was no real win for the European Union for standing up for Taiwan when its focus has been, for the past nearly 30 years, has been economic relations with China at the expense of sort of standing up for its own values. And I think that one reflects a shift, and that's kind of the thing where really, I mean, what Czech, and with no disrespect to Czech politicians, on the global stage, that visit was not a huge deal until China made it a big deal. They could have simply just went, yeah, whatever, fine, like doesn't matter, and nobody would have said anything, right? You wouldn't have had you wouldn't have had the German government criticizing the Chinese government for its reaction. And this again drew a lot of attention to what was basically seen as China's overreaction, and this sort of absurd position of having to criticize anybody visiting Taiwan and talk about economic repercussions for simply, a political visit and things like that. And like when you had Lithuania allowing the opening of the office in its capital, where it used the name Taiwan instead of Taipei. And, China withdrew its ambassador in protest to this over the name of the office, and because this is a politically sensitive issue. And again, this just drew more attention to what was happening, and people were like, oh, look at Lithuania. And Lithuania received diplomatic and economic support from the US because, China took retaliatory action against Lithuania. And the US said, well, we support Taiwan, so we've got your back on this. And again, it just drew more attention. So I think this is where the sort of like, although for domestic audiences, it can work well for Xi for being able to say, oh, look, this external interference is just the continued imperialism of the West. But on the international stage, it doesn't work at all for China, because they just look completely reactionary and to a certain degree immature about these kind of things as well. And I think that's strongly contrasted against, the development of Taiwan. Because although Taiwan's a democracy, it's important to remember it's a relatively young democracy. It only had its first democratic presidential elections back in 1996. But it has developed remarkably well in that time, and its economy has continued to flourish, and it's become an increasingly important, part of the global economy. And I think that more politicians, particularly in Europe, are starting to recognize that there's value in supporting those kinds of countries, and particularly in not just like respect of what China's doing with respect to Taiwan, but more generally the situation where democracy seems to be rolling back across the world. And there's internal threats to, we're not talking just the external threats to democracy, but increasingly in what we consider to be established democracies, we're seeing internal challenges to democracy, increasingly illiberal forces trying to gain power and trying to rewrite the laws and rules and undermine what we'd call liberal democratic values. I think there's a now wider recognition that, even in places like Taiwan, where we don't have massive economic interests and where we don't officially recognize them as state, it's still important to kind of support its democratic governance and democratic society. So I think it's really been interesting that China has inadvertently helped Taiwan in that way by getting more attention drawn to Taiwan's situation through its reactions to, these political visits from European leaders.
I mean, this is the time I think we should talk about this Thucydides trap. Are you actually heading for that kind of scenario? Because it looks like, the way we see America, because America hasn't been doing well last couple of years, okay, in terms of, Afghanistan debacle, Iraq war, and the internal domestic politics. And, lots of things are not like, positive for America. So And at the same time, obviously, China did really good leap in terms of economy over the last 20, 30 years. But at the same time, it's been slowing down as well. So out of these two scenario, and also we see like South China Sea is like totally militarized as well. So it's a kind of time. Do you think that this time is now or?
Yeah, you're maybe not going to like this answer, but I'm quite critical of the Thucydides trap concept. Yeah. Like there's, this was popularized fairly recently by Graham Allison's book on like Destined for War and like the repopularization of the Thucydides trap. There's been some good writings on why like the Thucydides trap concept is conceptually flawed and also not applicable. But what I'll talk about instead is my old favorite of power transition theory, which is how I analyzed US-China relations. And so the kind of crux of power transition theory is that when there is a dominant power within a system, which is currently the US, when it is faced with a rising power, then this creates potential for conflict between the dominant power and the rising power as the rising power reaches a degree of parity in terms of power. Now, there are certain conditions in power transition theory that heighten the potential for conflict between the two sides. One is the speed of the closing of the relative gap, and if the dominant power is sort of stagnant or declining. So China has an unprecedented economic rise over the past 3-4 decades. So that's one contributing factor. The other one is when there is ideological mismatch between them, particularly because the US as the dominant power is this liberal democratic state, and the rising challenger is an authoritarian state. That domestic regime type matters in that context, and whether the rising power is satisfied or dissatisfied with the status quo of the international system. And most would suggest that, increasingly China is showing signs of dissatisfaction with the Western-led rules-based order, and like the creation of the so-called shadow institutions like the BRICS Development Bank and the AIIB are evidence that China's wanting to set up its own institutions and control power through those as alternatives to the institutions that have been created and dominated by the West since the middle of the 20th century. So these conditions would suggest, from power transition theory, is that create potential for conflict, and power transition theory, there are different interpretations as to who strikes first. Is it the rising power who becomes confident and then strikes the dominant power when it thinks it's capable of doing it? Is it the dominant power who seeks to thwart the challenge before the challenger overtakes it by trying sort of last ditch attempt to maintain its position? And in my thesis and in the subsequent book that came out of that, I criticized power transition theory quite a lot and said, power transition theory is essentially a form of realism. It's very focused on the structure and the distribution of power in the system. It's less attentive to how policymakers view things. And I looked at the perceptions of China and how these particular distinct perceptions, like China as a economic opportunity, as an economic threat, or as a political opportunity, or some kind of normative ideological threat to the West, how these different perceptions pervade policy discourse and how this is translated into policy. And the core of my argument was that perceptions of China as an economic opportunity and as a potential, state that could be integrated into the existing order has prevented the US from acting in accordance with what power transition theory suggests we should do. And I made this point that power transition theory, although the theory is quite sophisticated, the basic precept of it has translated into conventional wisdom that an established power will eventually fight a rising power. And I said that, the dire predictions of power transition theory can be averted. It's not predetermined that this has to happen. We can have a transition. If it's going to be a transition at all, it doesn't necessarily have to fall into this historical pattern. And part of my argument was that leaders are increasingly aware of this historical situation. And when Obama was president, Obama and Xi had this joint speech where they said they were going to avoid the historical pattern of great power politics and to forge a new great power politics. And I think that kind of optimism has faded to a degree. But I still don't think that power transition theory's warnings are inevitable. And I think part of it is like, I mean, there's a whole series of factors. You could talk about nuclear politics. You could talk about the change sort of priorities where things like climate change are more important than who's sitting at the top of the international system at any given time. So in terms of these kind of like concerns that we're going to follow into this sort of like historical pattern of great power conflict, I think I'm still kind of an optimist in that sense. I don't think it is inevitable that these kind of conflicts emerge. I do think we're in for a sustained period of competition and rivalry, but I don't think it necessarily means that they end up going to war with each other. So I'm still a critic of power transition theory in that respect, and I think it's kind of I've long been kind of critical of these people that, you know, say that like we're definitely going to have some kind of like conflict between the US and China, and that, you know, that there's been a lot of literature produced in the sort of the US, not academic literature, but the sort of like journalists write their books on like, you know, the threat from China. In the late 90s, there were still a lot of books that were coming out with like, you know, not very well hidden racist tropes about China, and like talking about the yellow peril and stuff like that. And you still get that. And like Peter Navarro, who was one of Trump's economic advisors, he authored a series of books that were all about the China threat, and very much trumped up this idea of a conflict between the US and China. And these kind of things that I personally don't think have a lot of credibility, but there is an audience for this kind of sort of stuff at the moment. But I think I'm kind of optimistic, or I want to remain optimistic, that policymakers can make better decisions about this. And that doesn't mean we have to make lots of concessions to People's Republic of China, or accept that their government, their domestic governance and the way they treat their own citizens is legitimate. But I just think that there's enough invested in like global stability that we can overcome these kind of things and we can avoid. But maybe I'm going to be wrong. Maybe maybe my optimism is misplaced, and maybe we will end up seeing some kind of large scale conflict. But I hope not.
No, I was talking to my PhD supervisor a couple of months ago, and one thing he was saying that, you know, the way we build the world post Second World War, some kind of order-based system. So like suddenly, you know, it's kind of crumbling, and we are not seeing that kind of, you know, order-based society anymore. The things can happen, and like Russia's invasion in like Ukraine is one of the things. So like, you know, just so, you know, unreal. So that kind of scenario can actually happen to like Taiwan as well. On the spur of the moment, China suddenly decided that let's do it, because perhaps just miscalculation, and then we don't know like how the USA and the West will react, and then what it will bring. I mean, because it looks like, you know, so like now suddenly not one nuclear power they're fighting against, now the two nuclear power they will be fighting against. So that's like more unpredictable.
Yeah.
But, you are okay with like a couple of things like to touch about this thing. Two things here. Like one is China is next door to Taiwan, not far away. And it seems they are interacting with each other for some time now. The way I see, like, the powerful countries always try to infiltrate the security of the other people. What are the chances that China already infiltrated Taiwan's military? You know, the way we see, like, you know, it's like America has been doing it for years with other countries. Russia has been doing it, like Ukraine as well. So these are quite common practice in terms of international relations and politics. What's your take on that?
I mean, I do not have the expertise to say whether it has happened or the extent to which it has happened. I'm sure, like, if we look at the way, you know, we now know that China, you know, keeps tabs on its own citizens around the world, never mind, you know, foreign citizens. I'm sure that it's using whatever mechanisms it can to maximize its own interests, and so on. Whether it has happened or not is very hard to say. For me, I'm not in a position to comment on that. But yeah, I don't think China's exceptional in the sense that it's going to behave differently to how other powerful nations have in the past. I think it's going to perform much like they have. And like there's this common trope that the Chinese are great students of history, and they're going to avoid all these mistakes that other powers have made in the past. I don't think that's true. I think they're behaving pretty much like other great powers have through history, and arguably even more assertively so in some regards. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that is indeed the case, but I'm just not in a position to say whether it is happening or not.
Mm-hmm. Couple of yes/no question. You just answer yes, no.
Sure.
So like Xi will be in power in 10 years time still?
Yeah, yes. Despite his age, I'll say yes.
Taiwan will be still the same as it is now, the status quo, in 10 years time?
Yes.
It's like longer yes/no question. Like the way we saw like Xi came to UK and then, with David Cameron, went to a pub and have a pint. That kind of scenario will happen again?
No.
Either with America or...
not with Xi, and not in Western nations, no. In the future, I would like to think that there are different set of Chinese leaders who are not as well. Let's say in the future, what I would like to see is a democratic Chinese leadership with democratic Western leaders. That's my kind of optimism. In the short term, I don't see that happening. They'll still have handshakes at the G20, and those for their photo opportunities and so on. But no, I think that kind of the sort of golden era sort of stuff for Ukraine relations is gone. And I just don't think there are many Western countries that are kind of, although they want good relations with China, good economic relations, I think if we look back at those images now, I think people are a lot more critical, even than they were at the time, of what kind of, having Xi Jinping clink glasses with the Queen and stuff. Like, I think people are a lot more cautious about that now than they were. So under current conditions, no.
So I think we can stop here, because there are no, certainty of international politics. I mean, things can change today, tomorrow. But we just thought that we need to have a discussion, and if our students or like the audience learn something from it, good for us. But we thought just like give us some kind of insight what's going on. But also this is an important topic as well, because this will shape or unshape the world politics. So I think we have to be smart and know about these things, because these are important events which will change the world. Any last thought about the whole thing?
Nothing to add that I haven't already said. No, thanks.
No, thank you so much.
Please do check out the forthcoming special issue on One China policy. Because I think the problem with my paper is that it's kind of outdated already. So much has happened the past few months with the EU and Taiwan that I wasn't able to capture in the paper. And when I was invited to write the paper for a workshop 2 years ago by Dalton Lin, because he's my former colleague, I was like, there's not going to be too much to write about because Taiwan just doesn't feature in the EU, so I'll need to write about that. And then between the workshop and submitting it for publication, enough had changed that the paper changed. And then even after I got my revision request from the journal, there were new developments that have taken place. Unfortunately, I'm at the point where I can't now change the paper anymore because it's been accepted and we're just doing proofs. But I think like particularly my colleagues' papers there really show kind of like the importance of understanding the difference between the One China principle and the One China policies of various international actors, because the papers cover a wide variety of actors and look at the importance, because yeah, this is obviously the 50th anniversary.
So yeah, thank you so much. Much appreciated. It's a short notice, but we thought this is so important. We really need to talk. And the first thing come to my mind is you. And then also you talked about your colleague from previous university. Plan is to get him on board as well, and some kind of workshop style, some kind of conversation.
No, that'd be good. But yeah, yeah, disclaimer that like any mistakes are all my own.
No, that's fine. Yeah,
anyone else.
Okay.
Yeah, check out the work of people like Dalton Lin, Adam Liff, Yuji Chen, and so on, that are going to be in this special issue, because their work is really good on this. And I'm just someone that studies EU foreign policy that happens to be about China, so that's really where I'm coming at from this. But yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Cheers. Thank you, man. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Abdullah.